it's a few years now since we put together Embracing Change, and obviously the original idea behind that was to start helping congregations to think about the changes that were coming up for them in the future and thinking about how they could start to adapt and innovate in order to secure their future. Obviously, quite a lot's moved on since then, and I think it'd be useful to start perhaps by revisiting those original themes that we'd looked at in Embracing Change. Clearly, there were two, I think, quite standout ways that we suggested that congregations could be looking at dealing with the future, but they were perhaps quite traditional in approach. And obviously the first one of those was looking at the idea of hiving off particular works and ministries. So in particular, congregations that had run care homes or schools, and looking at that idea of transferring them out to be run by a third party. And I think obviously we've seen quite a lot of that done in recent years.
Yes.
And those projects have probably now reached sort of maturity, and it's maybe time to revisit some of the questions behind how those arrangements work. So I think traditionally for me, there's always been this question about retaining some form of control and linkage with the entity that you've hived off, and then thinking about whether that linkage is still appropriate.
I think so. If you think back, most congregations that started to hive off schools or care homes probably started that exercise, 8 to 10 years ago. And I think when they were beginning that, there was a lot of nervousness about whether they should be handing over institutions that they'd built up and that really defined them. And I think almost without exception, most of those hive-offs have proved to be successful.
Yes.
So I think you're right. I think the time now has come to revisit and to think about whether the ties that were put in place 8 to 10 years ago are still appropriate now, how long they should be in place. And I do think, for example, many of the hive-offs involved a lease of a property. And I think many of those leases were long leases. Some of them were for a peppercorn. Some of them were for a commercial rent, in inverted commas. Now, in some cases, that commercial rent is still needed, but I'm not sure whether the lease itself is still appropriate, or whether there needs to be a consideration as to whether actually you should be giving the institution the freehold, and either just giving it or indeed selling it, and instead of a rent you could have a mortgage repayment or something of that nature.
I mean, I think certainly the lease has sometimes been seen as a sort of form of control of what could be done on the property. But I think what I've always worried about is when the lease is a very long-term lease, who's actually going to deal with the freehold in 100 years' time? And as you say, the ones that have been granted on a peppercorn, I'm assuming that the value of that freehold isn't really reflected in the balance sheet anywhere of those congregations.
No, it wouldn't be.
No. So those ones, it seems there may be some reason why actually one could look at transferring now the freehold to the school, maybe having in place appropriate provisions in case it should get used for development in the future or something like that. I can see where there's a commercial rent coming in, that's probably a much more difficult situation because the congregation is still relying upon that rent. But again, I would have thought potentially you could look at selling to the school and maybe paying through instalments similar to paying the rent. I'm not sure if you've come across.
Yeah, and that's what I mean really by a mortgage. So effectively, the school or the care home would purchase the property. The congregation would effectively lend it the purchase price. And then over, a 25-year period, a 30-year period, or something of that nature, in the same sort of length as you would have with a mortgage that you and I would have on our house, the institution, the school, the care home would simply repay that loan, and that repayment would probably, in reality, be equivalent to the rent that they're paying today. And I think the other thing to just bear in mind with this arrangement, I think it's often easier for the institution to raise money, raise funds, to invest if it has a freehold title as opposed to a leasehold title. And I think many of these institutions have proved that, you know, they can govern this organisation well. Some of them have got some exciting plans, and I think those exciting plans can come to fruition if they were able to finance them, and actually being able to say to a bank, we've got a freehold that can be used as security, is often one way of securing that finance.
I think that's right, isn't it? I think it's those institutions that have shown the maturity and actually got to that point where they're stable. But the question of governance is an interesting one as well, because that's the other area we sometimes see linkage, where the congregation has retained a right to continue appointing governors or trustees, or actually in some cases still are the governors and trustees.
Exactly.
And again, I think now is probably the time to start thinking about, if they're struggling to find trustees for their own congregation, whether it's right to be saying we want to pass that burden on to somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you changed the governance requirements of the school or the care home such that there wasn't a requirement for the congregation to have trustees of that organisation, there's nothing to stop that organisation asking the congregation, would a couple of the members like to be trustees, so that involvement can continue. I think the other thing that sometimes is apparent is congregations are less willing to give up that role because they fear that it will mean the end of their involvement with the institution. And I think there are other imaginative ways in which the congregation can continue to have some involvement. I was talking to a congregation earlier this week, and they traditionally ran schools, and long ago those schools were passed over to independent control, and the sisters no longer have any say in terms of being governors or anything of that nature. But what they do is, I think 2 or 3 afternoons a year, a number of the members of the congregation go in and they talk to the sixth form, and they talk about the history of the congregation, what it meant to enter religious life, and give them an update, or give them information really about the foundation of the school, the history of the school. And I think that's a really good way of, you know, talking with youngsters and getting them to understand the way religious life actually worked in this country.
And in many ways that retains a much stronger link, doesn't it? Because it's actually a more living example as opposed to a lease or governance arrangement.
Yeah, and it means that the sisters in this particular case have a direct interaction with the girls and the boys. And I think they in turn get an insight into a life that they've probably never really thought about.
And the other area that we explored in Embracing Change was obviously the whole idea of incorporation, and looking at that as a way to transform and rebirth the charity and ensure that there was a way to bring in lay trustees with limited liability or overseas trustees. And I think, again, that's something we've seen a lot of congregations now picking up and dealing with. And I certainly think we're getting to a point where people have done that successfully and made that transition.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have been involved with mutual clients on a number of incorporations and transfers from charitable trusts to CIOs. And I think without fail, it has worked. I think it has surprised some of them, the amount of work and organisation and research they've had to do as part of that incorporation. But again, I think that's all for the good, because what it's meant is that everything has now been put in place and things have been tidied up, and hopefully going forward they're moving forward from a good position.
I think for me that's been one of the key things about it, is that sort of housekeeping activity. And I know we as a firm, we've recently moved out of an office we'd been in since the 1820s, and it's the first time people have looked in the basement and found certain things and thought, who does this actually belong to? And I know on a number of the incorporations we've done, it's been very similar. People have said, well, we know this or we know that, and it's turned out that those have been rumours or false ideas, and we've been able to tidy everything up and get it back into a nice, clean, tidy state, which has been good. I think one of the questions, though, around incorporation has obviously been this idea of bringing in trustees from outside the congregation. And I've started to see more congregations thinking about statements of values
Yes.
and effectively getting their trustees to sign up to a document saying this is what the values of the congregation are and this is how we'd like you to behave. Have you seen that working successfully?
I think it does work successfully in some cases. I think whether you get people to sign up to it, I think the danger with having a document that you ask people to sign is they read it, they sign it, and then it's put back in a box and never really brought out again. What I think is far better, personally, and I've got at least one congregation that does this, is to bring out some form of values training. So as the organisation moves forward, what the congregation does is it has a training programme. And again, it's a little bit like the sisters were doing with the children at the school I was talking about a minute ago. But it's thinking about explaining to people the values of this particular congregation, how they've been demonstrated in the past, and how they really want those values to continue, albeit they will develop, because that they need to change as life changes. But what I've found is that that training hasn't just been for trustees, but it's been so successful and so in demand in a way that the employees have wanted it. Yeah. And it has really expanded, and everybody has incredibly, embraced it. And I think it's also been exciting for the sisters in this particular case, because it's meant that they've been able to develop a programme and get involved, and they actually do feel that they are passing over information and their way of thinking, and it will stay with people far longer than simply reading a piece of paper and then signing it.
Yes, that's successfully embedding that culture across the whole organisation, isn't it? Which I think certainly, you're right, just signing a document is very easy to do, but it's actually living it and breathing those values.
I think the other thing that it brings out is we all like to think that values don't change, but they do. They're interpreted differently as time goes by. And I think if you are having a conversation, that conversation is continuing through a training programme or whatever, you bring in different perspectives, and people can develop those values far more than a piece of paper, which I think can quite easily become outdated.
Yes. So, I mean, those were the two sort of core themes we looked at in Embracing Change, the hive-off model and the incorporation model. And I think we're now, as I said, a number of years on from that. And I think congregations are starting to look again at what the future holds for them and thinking about their evolution. And for me, I always like to think around the idea of chapters being like chapters in a book. And I think there are a number of different ways that people in congregations are approaching their future. And certainly one of those options to me is very much around completion and bringing the book to an end and writing almost that final chapter or chapters. And I know there are a number of congregations who are thinking about that because they've got to a point where numbers are low. And it's about how you bring that completion to an end in an orderly manner. And I think obviously the congregation disappearing is one thing, but dealing with the charity raises a lot of issues.
Different. Yeah.
And obviously one of the issues is dealing with your assets and how to dispose of them. So have you had thoughts about the best way to do that?
I think it's interesting because depending, I think, on the structure of the congregation and ultimately the wishes of the members of that congregation, I think there are different scenarios. I think one scenario is that the charity and the congregation here in the UK exists until the last member passes away, and then assets are distributed, and that's the end of it. And that's your end of the book.
Yeah.
I think in some cases the book ends, but there is a sequel, and that sequel may be that the charity continues in some form, or another charity is established and some other form of activity is undertaken, whether that be grant making or continuing the work of the congregation, albeit in a different format. I think both of those, and I think what we're seeing with the first of those, where congregations are basically planning for the end is very much where there is perhaps not an international presence, but where you've got a very defined community, and essentially they want to live the rest of their lives, but then they're very clear what they want to happen to their assets. And I think, in a couple of cases I've seen that built into a dissolution clause.
Yes.
Within the governing document. And obviously the planning then is who is actually going to see that through. And that's about appointing other trustees, isn't it? Or having in mind people that will do that work.
That's right. And I think there's always this overriding need to make sure that the last members of the congregation are looked after and that their care needs are met.
Yes.
And that's where you do always, have this difficult issue, don't you, of should the charity wind up first and make provision for that in some manner, or do you keep the charity running until there's nobody left who needs the care from it? And I've seen both models. Obviously, where you do decide you're just going to bring it to an end and the money is going to go somewhere else, that's where you then have the questions about how can you successfully transfer those funds on, not least because of all of those issues with HMRC wanting to see some form of due diligence and monitoring of how those funds are used.
Yeah, and whether you're a grant-making charity or whether you're just giving away assets at the end of a life of a charity, HMRC and the Charity Commission will want to ensure that those assets are used in a way that's consistent with the purposes of the charity, but also that's fulfilled.
One of the other ways that people have dealt with this is obviously thinking, as you said, about somebody else coming in and writing the next chapters of the book, and in particular almost continuing the charity in a slightly different sort of legacy way. And one of the ways that people have done that is very much through grant making and establishing grant making programs. And have you seen successful examples of that?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of very successful situations where not setting up new charities, but actually within the existing congregational charity. And often it has been developed in response to a significant property sale or something of that nature, where suddenly the congregation has converted a property asset into a liquid asset, probably liquid assets which were significantly in excess of the value of the property in the accounts. And the thought process has been, well, what do we want to do with this money? And as you rightly say, I think the first thing is to make sure that the congregation has sufficient money, plus a bit more, to look after and care for the members for the rest of their lives. And I think the one thing I would always urge any congregation to do is to be very cautious about that, because care costs in this country are high, as we discussed in our last session. But I think if congregations then do decide that they've got excess money, yes, some of them are thinking very seriously about grant making. And as I said, a couple of them have done that in a very professional manner. So they've given a lot of thought and discernment about what are the causes that they want to support. And that has involved not just the trustees or the general or the provincial council, but it's involved talking to all of the sisters, because ultimately, of course, it's the money and the assets that have accumulated over the years. Some of that money has come from the sisters across the congregation because of pensions, salaries and things. So I think it's absolutely right that everybody has a say in what actually happens to this money. So they've discerned, they've come up with a number of causes that they want to support, and that could well be a decision to support their own congregation, either their generalate or other provinces, perhaps in areas of the world where the congregation is still growing or there are younger members. Or it could be to support different causes here in the UK, either charitable causes or indeed to support individuals on an education programme and so on. So I think, yes, that has been done. And then once they've actually decided what they want to support, they've then taken the step of employing a grants administrator, because I think the one thing that everybody needs to understand when you are seriously talking about a grant making programme is it involves quite a lot of administration. Yep. It involves a lot of due diligence. You can't just give money away. And so you do need to think about how is it going to work, how is it going to be administered. And in both of the cases I'm thinking of, they've taken on a full-time grants administration employee. And to begin with, what that employee has been involved in is actually helping them to develop the programme. So to think about application forms, to think about websites, how they publicise the fact that they're giving money away. And in both cases, it's been, I think, incredibly successful and brought new life in a way to the members of the congregation, because suddenly they've been involved with organisations that they wouldn't normally be involved in. They've been visiting people because part of the due diligence is to make sure and to see how their money has been used. And I think they've really gained a feeling that, we can no longer do the work that traditionally we've done, but our money can facilitate other people to do that work or similar work, and we can still be involved in it. We can still get excited about seeing the results of what our money has enabled.
And in most cases, are you seeing this set up as a sort of a long-term permanent programme, or is it a case of spending the money that's there and then that will run out at a fairly short period of time?
In both cases, it has been designed as a long-term programme. It's interesting that in one of the cases, they sort of split the money. So they've got a pot of money which is very much long-term and is going to be used to make money available to charities here in the UK that are involved in areas of the work that the congregation traditionally has been involved in. The other pot of money was very much set aside for their own congregation. And I think the view is that that money will be spent down. So they will actually spend the capital of that, and there will come a point where they have passed that across to the broader congregation. The broader congregation has taken control of it. But I think as long as possible, they want the money that's meant to be spent here in the UK to continue to be under their control. And ultimately they see that lay trustees will be appointed, and lay trustees will continue to care for the sisters, but ultimately this will be a grant-making charity. And there's no reason for that grant-making charity. It can't still be here in 100 years' time, making money available to causes that the congregation, causes that were dear to the congregation's heart.
And in a similar way, as we talked a bit earlier about the statement of values that sometimes lay trustees are being signed up to, are grant policies, in your experience, going down the same route of very much tying to the ethos and values of the congregation?
Very much so. So I think, if the congregation has traditionally been something involved in education, what we're seeing is the grant making is very much focused on young people, on advancing the education of young people. Similarly with congregations that have been more involved in the more general social and pastoral work, giving money to charities that perhaps are dealing with homelessness, social issues and things like that. Yeah.
And again, with grant making, obviously when you give a grant, sometimes the money is spent and it all just disappears. But obviously sometimes you can be grant funding a project and then that project goes on and has more life and continues. And are you seeing more of a favour for people to grant fund projects as opposed to handouts, for want of a better word?
I think there's definitely a preference to multi-year fund. So, and again, one of the decisions I think you need to make at the start of a grant making programme is, do you fund specific projects or do you provide core funding? The problem with providing core funding is the organisation you're giving it to can become quite reliant upon it. So I think there is much more of a tendency to fund specific projects that perhaps have a limited life, and a 3 to 5 year life, a 3 to 5 year grant can actually make the difference. And at the end of that, hopefully you've got something tangible to actually show for what you've achieved with the money.
Yeah. And I think another area, sort of a different approach to taking forward the story that I've seen, is congregations actually setting up projects themselves in new charities. And so not the sort of traditional hive off of something they've previously done, but actually saying we're going to set up something completely new, fund it in a proper way, and then bring in some other people to help us run it. And I can think of one particular congregation that, for example, has set up a housing project and is looking to provide housing as part of a mission, and using some of their existing properties have been put into it as well. Are you coming across examples like that?
I haven't come across as many examples of that. What I have seen is congregations that traditionally have set up projects where those projects have become legal entities in their own right, they've been hived off. There is a continuing, I think, desire to make sure that they continue to be successful. So again, we're seeing money set aside for those particular projects. But yeah, I think all of this requires a lot of discernment. And I think there are a lot of ideas and a lot of possibilities. And I think it's about being imaginative, isn't it? And that example that you're just talking about, that you can think immediately of a number of other areas where congregations could establish something that is going to continue long term.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting as well, because a lot of that is about looking forward and projects for the future. What I've also noticed is a number of congregations reflecting on their ethos and history and heritage, and actually looking at projects that fund research into producing documents about what they've done and their part they've played in society.
And I think that goes hand in hand with many of them thinking very seriously about what do we do with our archives, and are our archives just locked up somewhere and never seen again, or actually do we give them to a university, do we make them available so that people can carry out research? And there are universities, I think Durham is one of the key examples, which really are taking forward a lot of that sort of heritage and trying to make sure that religious life isn't forgotten in this country.
And I think, again, feeding on that theme, one of the things I'm starting to see now is people looking at other ways of supporting living in community. So accepting that perhaps the model of religious life doesn't work for some people, and looking at different ways to build a community, share values, and almost separate their ministry from their religious life.
Yeah, and I think religious congregations, I suppose, are facing decline in this country because they're not getting new vocations. The age profile is significantly high now, but I don't think that reflects the fact that religion necessarily is dying in this country. I think there is a lot of spirituality, and I think there are other ways of advancing religious life in non-traditional ways, and whether it's through friends of or associates or something like that. I think there are lots of examples of congregations that are really starting to develop those sorts of programs. I don't know whether you've seen that.
Yes, a bit of it. I think it's always difficult, isn't it, for people to envisage a different way of life to the way of life that they've lived. And I think what's been exciting is, yes, working with some of the congregations who've actually said, right, we want to respect our way of life, but we also want to think how we can build on it and actually work with people who want to work with us and understand what we are, but perhaps not necessarily live in exactly the same way as us.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's been interesting for me is looking at some other countries. So, for example, in Australia, I know there's been programs much more about collaboration and trying to find a sort of central vehicle that can provide a lot of support and services to congregations. But I've not seen a sort of appetite for that really in this country.
No, I don't know whether that says something about the character of the people here. I don't know. I think it is slowly beginning to happen. I think many congregations have been very proud of their independence from other congregations in this country. But I think now there is a feeling that, we do need to collaborate. We all facing the same problems. Why do we keep reinventing the wheel every time? And so I'm slowly beginning to see congregations talking about shared properties, about possibly sharing resources in terms of an accounting function or an administrative function and things like that. But it has been incredibly slow off the ground.
I mean, it's interesting because I know there's religious orders in education, so that's a sort of a start on that area. And obviously on the safeguarding side, there's the Religious Life Safeguarding Service that's going to come together and be more of a collaboration. So it'd be interesting to see over the next few years where there is more of a development in that collaboration and perhaps sharing of services. And I've seen a little bit of some congregations providing trustees to other congregations, but again, that seems to be very limited, I think, at the moment.
It's very limited, I think. I think that the interesting thing about all of this is whether it develops more as you get more lay trustees involved. And I think lay trustees, possibly because of their background, will be more willing to reach out and actually say, can you help? How do you do this? Can we get together? Can we work together? And I think, again, that's a good thing. And I think it will bring in an opportunity for some of the religious trustees to also talk to one another in a way that possibly they haven't done in the past. I think congregations have talked about various things and they've collaborated with various things, but not necessarily about governance and the way their charity is actually run.
I think what's been the most interesting for me is, obviously we talked earlier about the analogy of books, and certainly, yes, there's been that sort of feeling we're writing the final chapters. And I think now many congregations are actually looking forward and saying this is an opportunity to start thinking about the next book, the sequel, or the next chapter, and introducing other people in to help us take forward our story. I think, to me, that's very exciting and very inspiring.
I think it's hugely exciting and inspiring, and I think congregations need to enthuse their members, because I don't think this is necessarily the end. I think there is another another book, another sequel, but I think it will be different. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the congregation is forgotten in this country, or its work is forgotten. It continues, but it continues in a different way.
And that really brings us back, doesn't it, to the theme of these talks, which have been about walking in partnership.
Yes.
And obviously that idea that the next phase of the story is perhaps walking alongside somebody else and then maybe handing over, and then they carry forward the burden for you.
I think so. And I think in a way, it's about what trusteeship is all about. You hold in the palms of your hand an entity, the assets of an entity, for a short period of time. You carry them forward, and then you hand them over to your successors, the future trustees. And I think that's exactly where we are with congregations at the moment. And as you say, there will be other people that walk in partnership as time goes by.